turn it over to Matt for our next session. He's going to moderate our next session on the Outdoor Recreation Roundtable Toolkit. So I believe we might be the first to see this toolkit. So Matt, take it away.
Great. Thanks, Bevan, and thanks everyone for sticking with us for this day. This is our last session of the day. Yeah, in it we'll be hearing from Outdoor Recreation Roundtable, Chris Perkins, who works there. He's also a dual MBA, MEM candidate at the Yale School of Environment and Yale School of Management. I was a former dual worker and school candidate, so I imagine you must be busy. That's never an easy existence, so kudos to you for doing that. Sounds like Chris works to support the development of the outdoor industry by examining opportunities for community economic development, novel strategies for natural resource management, and improved access and equity for park poor communities. And we will hear a little bit about what he's been working on at Outdoor Rec, putting together this outdoor recreation toolkit. It's a lot of work that you guys might be familiar with and that he might have called you for it. So any critiques or input on this right now would be helpful, but it'll be a cool example to hear from. But before we get to that, I just wanted to turn it over to Lindsay Davis from Outdoor Recreation Roundtable to just give a little bit of a background on the stuff they're working on there, and then turn it over to Chris after that. Thanks.
Thanks, Matt, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Lindsay Davis. I'm the Vice President of the Outdoor Recreation Roundtable, which is one of NGA's sponsors, and we're the leading coalition of trade associations in the industry. We have 33 members that represent over 110,000 businesses, from RVing, boating, skiing, off-roading, diving, everything you could think of. It's been a really exciting year with this work. We've been focused on supporting rural economies in their transition to recreation with a couple of different programs in the toolkit that you're going to see today as one of those great products. But a little bit of background about this. So last year, the agencies, EPA, USDA, Forest Service, and Northern Border Regional Commission all came together to create the Recreation Economies for Rural Communities program. That launched. 170 communities applied for the technical assistance that program provided, and they were able to give it to 10. So it really showed this amazing demand for the transition to recreation across the country. So ORR, kind of in partnership with the work program and the VF Foundation, created a grant fund, and we were able to, out of those 10 communities, give an additional 4 a grant that further helped them implement their plans that were developed through the work program. And those grants from us and VF unlocked additional federal funding that they're eligible for. So really cool way to kind of get this all off the ground. And we're hoping that this goes so well that this year that it all goes into another big opportunity for the work program, and they can fund more communities as we look forward. So as you heard from Matt, we've been super fortunate to have Chris Perkins on our team this year, and in partnership with the Oregon State Outdoor Recreation Economy Initiative, they've developed this amazing toolkit that he's going to tell you about, and he interviewed stakeholders from all over the place to put this together. And so this is the most comprehensive resource we have on rural development so far. And we're really excited about all of the ways that this is going to help communities without recreation assets grow and develop their economies. So with that, I'll turn it over to Chris for this exclusive preview here.
Thank you, Lindsay. It has been a total pleasure to work with ORR over the past several months. As was mentioned, I'm currently a grad student at the Yale School of the Environment, Yale School of Management. In my final semester, I graduate in May, so doing this work with ORR was a pretty cool capstone for me. And as was also mentioned, I've been fortunate to work with many of the folks on this call in developing this resource. A lot of the state folks, RD, staff at EPA, so shout outs to everyone. The real inspiration here started with a conversation with Rachel Schmidt, who's the outgoing director of the Montana State Office of Outdoor Rec. And I remember Rachel saying, I have a lot of community members come to me with hopes of building an outdoor rec economy, But they're at step 1, and it would be so much easier for my bandwidth if they had some sort of resource to get them to step 5 or 6. And that was kind of like the guiding lens that I took in developing this. It's intended to be complementary to the work you all do already, whether it's in state offices of outdoor rec, the EPA Recreation Economy for Rural Communities program that Steph leads, USDA Rural Development, RTCA at NPS. All those programs are really tapped in, just super talented folks leading them. And I envision this as kind of an aggregator of all those resources and some best practices. This is currently in its online form, and with recognition that some communities don't have great internet access, we've also translated it into a PDF form that can be downloaded for offline viewing. I first just want to skip to the end, and this is sharing okay, I presume. Can you see it?
Yes, yeah, we can see it.
Awesome. I just wanted to, again, shout out Oregon State University's Outdoor Recreation Economy initiatives. That's Lee Davis, Aaron Gaines, and the amazing team over there. And then also NGA and the Outdoor Rec Learning Network that supported us with this. Yeah, so this resource was sourced through around 60 interviews over the summer. Those folks are listed here. That includes nonprofits, community economic development groups, city and county services, state and federal agencies, manufacturing, retail, tours and guides, pretty wide array of folks who helped me build like a kind of holistic sense of the process of building recreation economies. I know that this audience is probably quite skilled with the subject matter in the toolkit. So for today, I won't focus too much on content, but my hope is that I can leave you all with some understanding of how this works, so that when we launch next week, you're excited to share it with folks in and around your state and in your communities. We'll also be doing a webinar on the 21st. And we'll have time for 10 minutes of questions at the end. So hold on to your questions, or I also am like totally fine with this being interactive. If you need something clarified or want to make a point as I'm going on, feel free to jump in and interrupt, because you all are experts in this work. So this intro slide, all of you on the call are like quite aware of the potential for outdoor rec to be an economic driver in all sorts of communities, particularly in rural America. But we recognize that this work is really complicated and folks might not always know where to start. So this intro page is for a community member to self-select into their level of knowledge, whether they're just starting with an idea or they already have a coalition or collaborative formed of sorts. That would be, so starting from scratch, you would do this first one and just go through the whole toolkit. If you have some experience, you would skip ahead to the best practices building momentum section. If you're more experienced, you would go towards the end. The other thing I want to point out, this black button here links to a list of federal grants and technical assistance related to outdoor rec economies that we've put together. I tried to be pretty comprehensive in what was covered here. So it includes everything from USDA RD, like internet bandwidth grants and infrastructure, to a lot of the programs we've been talking about today. So we hope that this is also a very complimentary resource. So moving right along, let's just give some background on what's going on in rural America. And the point here is that a lot of traditional economies are sagging or lagging, particularly when you look at the extractive economy and transition into renewables. A lot of communities that have been historically reliant on energy extraction are in need of new economic development strategies. One thing I like about this toolkit is that it features quotes from practitioners as you go along. Here's a badass picture of Nathan, who's also on the call, as well as Rachel, who I mentioned earlier, who have experience at the state level. Here's just some background on the outdoor rec economy. So for a community member who's less aware of the size of the economy we're talking about, but also the amazing benefits it has on the community level in terms of both economic and public health. This page provides a really good backdrop. Includes some recent BEA data and links to studies that talk about the value of outdoor rec. Headwaters economics is cited quite frequently throughout. And this is really the backbone of the toolkit here. These are the 15 best practices that I identified through these interviews as kind of critical to the process of building these economies. And they're presented in a particular order, one that makes sense from sort of initial stages to more sophisticated communities. But as is true throughout this, like different communities are in very different stages depending on their demographics and their history and their values. So for certain communities, it might make sense to start at one step versus another. But this is, to me, what seems like the most important things for a community to be considering, and we'll go into more depth throughout. So as Mark at REI talks about here, and there's some great quotes from John from Washington and Pitt as well from Utah, just about the necessity of committed and passionate local leadership. This is not really a philosophy that can be parachuted from outside. The community has to have access to existing outdoor recreation resources and want to build on them. And so the quotes within here really emphasize that. Laurel Harkness here talks about just how time-consuming this work is of building an economy, and that states and regional economic development groups might even consider compensating the folks who lead this work. Throughout, there's buttons that link to exterior resources. So for instance, this one talks about the Granite Backcountry Alliance, which is a community organization that's been cutting glades for backcountry skiing, I believe in New Hampshire, and they've really developed a solid community network of volunteers to support this work. This has some background on economics, public health. I'll just keep rolling here. And throughout, I really tried to just capture a wide variety of perspectives. So this is Jim Glover, who does work down in New Mexico. Ta Enos, who works in the Pennsylvania wilds, which came up earlier, does really amazing work up there. And I'd say if I came away from this with a thesis statement of sorts, this section on building collaboratives would be it, that communities can really set themselves up for success by bringing the right people to the table at the beginning. And as Steph talks about here, that steering committees should be cross-sector, committed, dedicated, involving a wide array of representatives. And I tried to illustrate this immediately by providing examples of the sorts of representatives who might end up in these planning committees. So at the local, regional level, state, tribal, or federal. And towards the end here, I'm just going to jump forward. I have examples of how these collaboratives have taken shape in various different states, whether Wyoming, California, New Hampshire, North Carolina, New Mexico.
So Chris, do you have like some documents in there that, where people, if they want to start a collaborative, they have to have something written, like what, how do you do that? Like,
yeah, it's a good point. And for this, I would defer to experts like Steph, who actually prepares her communities with a pretty comprehensive set of documents in terms of who should be coming to the table, what sort of things they'd be considering. I think throughout, I linked to some of those resources. This also talks about the role of the public sector at the table. So Toby Bloom at USFS, who I believe is presenting tomorrow. Is that right?
Yeah, she'll be presenting tomorrow.
Cool. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. Let's see. This is the section that's most focused on the necessity of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in sort of centering the, or in inspiring the way that communities reach out to other members within the community. As Gabe Vasquez pointed out in our conversation, this really has to be a culturally conscious approach. No community is the same as the one next to it. Communities are, they have different economics, they have different racial and ethnic groups, religious affiliations, and so the approach from these collaboratives or from the state level really needs to be quite place-based. And here's a great example of Axie talking to her constituents in a way that I imagine really resonates with them. Also a focus here on this section about the importance of reaching out to Indigenous groups, particularly because outdoor recreation is predicated on land that was initially stolen from tribes. Indigenous groups are, need to be very at the front of some of this outreach. And I'm showcasing a story here about the Elliottsville Foundation in Maine and Lucas St. Clair, who recently worked with Chief, I believe his name's Kirk Francis from the Penobscot tribe to return hundreds of acres of land to the tribe. And I think that's just such a great example of how tribes can be incorporated in this work. And I mentioned RTCA earlier at the National Park Service, and here's just a great example from Attila Valley. There's been a lot of conversation today about the difficulty of matching funds, and the folks I interviewed with for this project felt the same way. Matching funds are quite difficult. So I in this section tried to capture all the various ways that communities have found funding, whether it's from the federal government, and I'll just again point out this resource that we've incorporated into the toolkit, but also using like extension services at land-grant universities throughout the country, CDFIs, local government, various nonprofits, philanthropy, and each of these has a pop-at so you can learn more about nonprofits that have supported this work. Doug Arbogast in West Virginia had some really great insight. There's this great initiative called the Mon Forest Towns Partnership that surrounds the Monongahela National Forest, where 10 or 12 towns are sharing administrative support, they're sharing branding resources. It's making the most out of limited resources for rural communities, and he outlined their funding partners here, which was really helpful. And the last section I'll just point out today, and then can open it up for some questions or commentary, is how state leaders like you all can attract and support outdoor businesses. So here's a list of the programs to incentivize manufacturing at the state level that came up in conversations. And finally, this resource would be incomplete if it didn't cover some of the major challenges that stand in the way of this work. Those challenges include just various cultural and environmental resistance. As Sarah talks about here, some of these communities have ingrained just fear of the next boom and bust cycle. And even if people are coming to the table with what feels like a great idea around building an outdoor rec economy, it may not feel that way to the community. Additionally, there's some concerns about the footprint of outdoor recreation, particularly as gear gets lighter and more durable and people recreate further. there just needs to be some really open conversations about how outdoor recreation and land management agencies can work together to limit negative impacts on wildlife corridors and species that live in the area. So there's some ideas here about studies that the outdoor industry could pursue. Other section here on just administrative bandwidth in rural communities. Earlier, we talked about how just these LWCF administrative requirements can be just quite challenging and burdensome, and that was something that came up in many of my interviews. So many leaders have existing commitments. It might be that the person you're hoping will lead your collaborative also has a business and a farm to run. That's an example that was cited in one of these conversations. So leaders just need to be quite aware, or the state leaders rather, have to be quite aware of some of the administrative challenges that face these communities. Conversations about the complexity of the grant requirements for LWCF, which we've talked about quite a bit today. And finally, this last section on the difficulties of acquiring that match. I'm preaching to the choir here, but that match is very difficult for certain rural communities. And towards the end of this section, the interviewees offer some suggestions for how to reach that match. For instance, Rick Jenkinson in the Granite Backcountry Alliance talks about hosting private events to raise revenue, getting local merchants involved. They have a great event called Wild Corn in the spring, where they have a great party that raises money for their land management efforts. And then finally, and then I'll open up for questions. Thanks for letting me take time at the end of the day here. Just some future directions for outdoor recreation. How can we expand the movement, get more people to the table? And so partnering with active transportation was mentioned a few times. Taldi at REI talked about upcoming transportation reauthorization bills that the outdoor industry could be involved with. Opportunities for the outdoor industry to just lean into the political process, whether it's through a 501c6 or other channels. I like this quote from Lucas a lot. What if the outdoor industry were to have an equivalent of the American Petroleum Institute? How do we make sure that every individual in America thinks that protecting public lands so that industries can thrive is a good thing, in the same way that we decided Ford F-150 trucks were the best flag waving thing out there? That, I think, is all I have to share for today. Thanks for your time. I'd love to open it up to your questions, and just to reiterate, this will go live next week, and we'll also be having a toolkit, a webinar rather, on the toolkit on January 21st. And the thing that would make us most happy is if you share this with as many communities as possible who would benefit from this work. We'd also love your feedback and ideas about what we could do with it next, areas that we can improve, whatever it might be. So thanks for your time, and I'd love to just open it up to questions.
Great, yeah, and anyone can just pop in. I saw Mary unmuted herself, so if you wanted to go right ahead, that's.
Thank you, Chris, that was wonderful, thank you. I had two thoughts. One is, was there any difference in your research? I noticed that I think all of the states or the photos were Western centric. Was there any difference in terms of how this might affect Midwest states and some of the issues or recommendations? Would it be the same for rural Wisconsin partners?
It's a really good question, Mary. I tried to capture best practices that I thought were applicable in any part of the country, whether it's in the Midwest, like in Wisconsin, where you are, or in the Southeast or Northeast, wherever. The difference that I would just point out, and this I think is particularly true of places like Colorado and Utah, is that outdoor rec is just really baked into the DNA of those states. where someone can bring up outdoor recreation at a legislative meeting or with an economic development council, and they just get it because everyone in those states enjoys recreating outside as just like a form of well-being. They see the businesses on the ground that have developed, and so it really greases the chain, so to speak, to make that work take off. My observation in Midwestern communities is that while there are tons of people who love to recreate outside, that connection between outdoor rec and economic development, public health, community vitality is still newer, and economic development strategies are still being pursued that just feel more familiar, whether it's like bringing in a new retail store or new restaurants, all of which are great and important, but outdoor rec is quite important too.
Right. And then the second thing in terms of what you could do to get it out, you know, there's ways and we have to get it out. But one thing I'm wondering is, would you be willing to expand the webinar opportunity to say we distributed to a series of rural Wisconsin partners who said, you know, I really want to understand this a little more. Would you be willing to do a 30-minute presentation if we could make that available?
That's a fantastic idea, one that is above my pay grade. So I'll defer that question to Lindsay. But I think it's great. Anything we can do to get rural communities to the table, talking to them one-on-one, understanding what they need and how we can support, I think is a really great idea. I should mention in the webinar, it won't just be me doing this. We'll also have Katie Allen from the Conservation Fund, Axie from New Mexico, and Toby Bloom from the Forest Service to bring the NGO, state, and federal perspectives to the table. So I plan to talk about it for maybe 20 minutes and then open it up to this panel of people who do this work on a daily basis and understand what communities need to just provide more context.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Mary.
Great, and I think I also saw Doug might have had a question in the chat. Not sure if you wanted to ask that, Doug.
This Doug?
Doug.
Yeah, I should have clarified, yeah.
Yeah. No, what I did is I listed PlayCore resources, and I don't know if Chris had access to that, but that lists a lot of local foundations, and it does include all the federal funds. So just take a look at that. I don't know if you could add it in there or not, or just use it as a reference. We've been
great, Doug.
Yeah, we've been working with them, and we're trying to. This is very good, but we're trying to put together a one source place that you can go and get information right on down to the community level, whether it's urban or rural. So we're working on it. Just wanted you to know.
Thanks so much, Doug. And I will definitely take a look at this resource after the call.
Great. Yeah, thanks. And I feel like this has been such a comprehensive project. So kudos to you for putting this all together. I think it's super helpful. And I guess, yeah, beyond the webinar, it just seems like connecting to the local champions that you mentioned as one of the best practices. Like, it seems like that's a good approach, but like, is there like sustained thoughts about how to get involved with those folks? And because I think anyone who could see this resource could probably benefit from something.
So your question, Matt, is how would state folks connect with the community leaders?
Yeah, I think that could be helpful, I guess, for the audience on this call.
Yeah, I would open that question to any of the state directors on this call. I feel like you all are the experts in how you find the passion on the ground. I don't know if any of you.
Will you repeat the question, please, Matt?
Sure. Just, yeah, how might you think of working on using this in spreading to community members or partners that you had identified?
How will we distribute it, or how will we utilize it?
Utilize it.
Utilize it. So I think I think what I'd like to do is really around connecting the dots around the tenets of our office. The economic piece is difficult because, you know, like we see with LWCF, there's all this information and opportunity, but you have to know a local match in a local community, which is, you know, all of our offices are, you know, one person director, really lean. And so we don't really have the ability to know what all the local matches are across the state. But when you have something like this that's all packaged so nicely, we did a webinar series. I just completed a virtual state tour, and we get really great responses to that. So I would use this as a toolkit as another opportunity to connect with our stakeholders and to broaden our industry relationships and say, okay, here's a way, you know, I know you've contacted me about building a trail, or you've contacted me about connecting with businesses in your community for workforce development. This is how you start getting those economic pieces together to say, we're really focused on creating economic outdoor recreation community in the rural areas. And then in addition, our Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation has a specific Office of Rural Prosperity. So I'm also going to utilize this to have a conversation, because connecting the dots among state agencies it's important, and it helps with our work when we understand what other offices are doing. So I think I'd use it in those two ways.
Great,
Yeah.
thanks, Mary. I'm just gonna swoop in here because it's 4 o'clock and we do want to respect your time and let you go, you know, on time. And so Chris, you had mentioned a webinar. Is this webinar, is our network going to be invited? Can we invite the people on this call to the webinar? Or is it just for ORR members? Or
Absolutely. Yeah, we'll make sure to extend the invite.
Yeah, okay.
We're in the process of putting together the details.
Yeah, I'm looking at the chat and everybody can't wait to get their hands on this tool. So I think they're really going to be able to get it out there for you. So good work. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
All right. And so before we head off and meet you all tomorrow, I just wanted to do a little readout on follow-up things that were mentioned today. So number one was we wanted to share this toolkit, the Rural Economic Development Toolkit, and then invite everybody to their webinar. We could also share those PlayCore resources that Doug from Nesorlo had mentioned. Also, Matt, were you keeping track of a list too of things to follow up from today?
Yes, I think that might be helpful in a send out afterwards, but also.
Okay. Well, I also wanted to mention that Mike Snyder from Vermont gave me a list on how their CARES Act was used for outdoor recreation. And I was talking to Jason from the earlier this morning's presentation from Colorado, and he wanted to collect information from all the states about the different ways they've used CARES Act funding. So we might coordinate with them on that. And then NGA did send out a survey to states on funding for recreation and conservation, matching funds or other funding sources that can be used for land and water conservation fund matches. So we want to, you know, get information from you all and all the rest of the states on that too. We could also send you the Secretary of Interior order that Joel mentioned. And we're also talking to Doug Aiken about the NGA Office of Government Relations about use of land and water conservation funds for administrative costs. And then Ricky had a question about whether tribes can use federal funds to match land and water conservation funds. So I don't know, Doug, do you know that answer right away? Ricky from Alaska had that question.
I don't know. I'm not aware of that.
Okay.
It depends. Joel would be the person to answer that.
Okay, so we could ask Joel if he's not on.
Yeah.
He might have dropped off, but we're going to follow up with him on that. And then Alicia, we wanted to follow up with you about the programs that you were thinking about that reduce match for BIPOC communities. And I think Chris had mentioned the Cory Booker Justice for Black Farmers Act, which maybe does some of that stuff. So that's our follow-up list so far. And I know Matt and Timothy were keeping track of things as well. So with that, and if we missed anything, certainly, you know, send us an email of things that were mentioned today if there's any follow-up items that we missed. And with that, I'd like to just end today and thank all of our speakers. I think it was a great day, great conversations, and we'll see you all tomorrow at noon.